Hi, I'm Amy Skilton. I'm a functional medicine practitioner, qualified mold testing technician, and a SIRS survivor. And I'm thrilled to be presenting you this session on mycotoxins, which are a sadly widespread environmental disruptor that is entirely invisible. Now, we're going to focus primarily on the metabolites produced by the 5 toxigenic molds that are tested for in the Hertzme 2 test. But before we dive into that, I just want to give you a little bit of background on what SIRS is as it relates to mycotoxin-based illness, define what a water damaged building is, and really give you the context for how many of your patients might be being impacted by a water damaged building. So starting with what SIRS is, the acronym CIRS stands for Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. And SIRS is actually an umbrella term that extends itself to a number of different environmental triggers. Perhaps the most well known and understood one is Lyme disease, but under that umbrella also falls a number of other iterations of SIRS, including breast implant illness, and in the case of today, any sort of SIRS that has been triggered by a water damaged building. Now, what exactly is a water damaged building? Well, the buildings that we live in and that we work in all have got water barriers and envelopes and ways of keeping water out of the interior of the building. So that includes the roofing, the guttering, the cladding, and the waterproof membrane. And the intention of that is to keep water from penetrating inside the actual building to where more porous materials lie. And those things include insulation, the timber framing, the flooring, things like carpet, and everything else inside that we ultimately don't want to get wet. Now, within 12 hours of water penetration that hasn't been dried immediately, we do see bacterial proliferation, but at about 48 hours onwards, we start to see mold flourishing and thriving. And so SIRS WDB really points to chronic inflammatory response syndrome triggered by a water damaged building. It's important to know that SIRS is in part driven by the biological toxins that the occupant of the building is exposed to, as well as the immune response from the innate side of the immune system. But ultimately, the response is into the chemical stew that occurs whenever water is introduced into the environment. You see, wherever water is, there is life, and every single microorganism that makes up the microbiome of that building actually starts to come to life when water is added to the abundant food resources that are present in that building. And so we see the immune response is in fact due to not just the biological toxins, but the microorganisms themselves, other compounds that they produce, as well as their spores and hyphae and DNA fragments. Now, when it comes to the different compounds they produce, we not only have volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, which of course produce the characteristic odors of microbial growth, but we also see mycotoxins, endotoxins, hemolysins, beta-glucans, and many other compounds that can trigger an immune response as well. But focusing today on the metabolites that mold produces, we're going to be looking at the biotoxins that fungi can generate in a water damaged building. Now, SIRS is sometimes also referred to as biotoxin illness because it is triggered by the biological toxins mold produces. And in the case of those who are genetically susceptible and develop full-blown SIRS, we do have a lovely map here of the way in which those toxins can trigger the various immune responses and the biomarkers that we see subsequently rising or falling as a result. But given that biological toxins can be produced by any microorganism, we're going to define the metabolites we're looking at today as mycotoxins, being those that have specifically been created by fungi or mold. Now, these toxic metabolites are capable of triggering illness in all living creatures, animals and humans included, and the term that is used to refer to these types of illnesses is mycotoxicosis. Now, very much like we get with man-made chemicals, we see similar pathologies occurring with mold-made chemicals. Although if you want to compare apples with apples, it does appear that mycotoxins are a lot more potent as toxicants than even man-made chemicals. Now, you might be wondering how this is relevant to your practice and to your patients. So I just want to share with you briefly what we know currently about the prevalence of water damaged buildings across the globe. Now, there is certainly a big gap here with the data that I would dearly love to see filled. But based on what is currently available, we know in Nordic countries, anywhere between 17 to 24% of buildings are water damaged. In the Netherlands, specifically 25%. Canada and New Zealand have got roughly 37% water damage rate of water damaged buildings. And in the US, where they have arguably the most robust data collection on this, it appears every second building is going to be water damage based on what we know. Now, as far as Australia goes, we don't have the same data collection as the USA, and so the World Health Organization have estimated that water damaged buildings are somewhere between 10 to 50% of our built environment. I have to share, though, in my personal experience on one house hunting expedition in Sydney, having examined 300 properties myself, I can count on one hand how many of them were not visibly water damaged, which means 98.3% of them were. And what's even more terrifying about that statistic is roughly 80% of the time the water damage is not obvious to the naked eye either. So what this means is, in all probability, 1 in every 2 of your patients is potentially living or working in a water damaged building and therefore being exposed to a chemical stew that is at least in part contributing to their health issues and potentially getting in the way of any protocols that you might be trying to engage them on. Now, when it comes to assessing a water damaged building, a building biologist or a mold testing technician can employ all kinds of assessment methods, including moisture mapping, because of course, wherever there is mold, there is moisture intrusion, and finding the source of moisture is the number one step. But in addition to that, actually getting a handle on how moldy a building is and also how water damaged / moldy it is can be done in a number of different ways. And one of the most popular assessments is an Amie test. Now, Amie stands for Environmental Relative Moldiness Index, and it was developed in 2006 by the US Department of Housing in order to actually quantify how moldy a home actually was. Now, it's a DNA-based method using PCR analysis, which means they can also ascertain not just the genus of the mold, but the species of the mold as well. Now, with this test, they're actually looking for 36 different indicator species. And within that list of 36, they have got a group of molds that are typically not associated with water damage and are rather associated with normal fungal ecology in a home. So what would be considered typical and not pathogenic of the microbiome of someone's residence. So there's 10 species that fit into that category and 26 species that do not. And those 26 actually indicate water damage to some degree or another. Now, the difference between these two groups provides the Amie score and therefore quantifying the relative moldiness of the home. Now, of course, it is relative based on the homes that they assayed at the time, but it is a really reliable test to determine how moldy a home is and certainly to highlight if there is any water damage. Interestingly, it's so good that it outperformed mold remediators in the detection of mold. And in one particular study, half of the homes that mold remediators said they're fine, the Amie actually found that they were very moldy. What we also know is that the Amie score is clearly associated with elevated levels of brain fog, memory deficits, and abnormalities in cognitive function, as well as exposure in infancy being a predictor of asthma at the age of 7. Now, for context, for SIRS patients who have been injured by mycotoxins, mold, and all that is in a water damaged building, the Amie score needs to be less than 2 for the home to be considered safe for occupation. Now, you can actually drill down into the Amie test and pull out what's called a HERTZ-Me2 score. Now, HERTZ-Me2 stands for Health Effects Roster of Type-Specific Formers of Mycotoxins and Inflammagens, and it's the second version of this particular roster. And essentially, it's a mold test that looks or analyzes the dust or the sample taken from the home for 5 pathogenic molds. And it knows, of course, what the mycotoxins and inflammagens these molds produce are. So when it comes to the HERTZ-Me2 score, this is also a very useful figure for SIRS patients to determine whether they are likely to become injured or ill or relapse in a building. For example, a score of over 15 means that building is absolutely not safe for a SIRS patient to enter, and statistically speaking, 99% of SIRS patients will relapse on exposure. A score of 11 to 15 is borderline, suggesting that the water damage needs to be addressed or remediated in order for the place to be made safe. And a score of less than 11 usually is safe for 99% of SIRS patients. Sadly, even medical grade remediation is not always going to be sufficient in order for a building to be made safe, but based on the numbers, this isn't a bad way to do a preliminary examination of potential residences and offices, but also check for post-remediation cleanliness as well. So just to show you what that looks like, this is a section from an Amie report highlighting in Group 1 all of the water damage molds that are assessed, as well as in Group 2 common indoor molds that are not associated with water damage. This is actually one specifically done on the property that made me ill. And you can see here the Amie score was 22.8, and anything over 20 is very high relative moldiness, so extreme. Anything over 5 is considered high relative moldiness. So this was a particularly toxic property, that's for sure. Now, looking at the HERTZ-Me2 score, we can see that that ended up at 50. Now, we know statistically speaking it has to be below 11 for a SIRS patient to even consider going back into the building. The only saving grace from this particular test was it highlighted there was no Stachybotrys in there, which is certainly the most toxigenic mold that we currently know about. So looking specifically at pathogenic molds and those that are ascertained by the HERTZ-Me2 score. I want you to know, though, before we dive into the HERTZ-Me2 molds, that this is not an exhaustive list of pathogenic molds or fungi that produce toxigenic mycotoxins. But as just a brief summary, what we do know that there are a number of pathogenic molds, including the ones we're going to look at in this session. But generally speaking, we know that they're neurotoxic, hepatotoxic, nephrotoxic, and in particular, children are very vulnerable, and postnatal exposure for 2 years or more has a significant impact on cognitive development, tripling the risk of a low IQ score. We also know that prenatal exposure to mycotoxins impacts neural development and the IQ of the offspring to be born. And of course, for adults, it too impacts our cognitive function and certainly behavior and mood in grown-ups and smaller humans is heavily influenced by mycotoxin exposure. But looking now specifically at these 5 molds, they are not listed in any particular order in terms of how toxigenic they are, only in alphabetical order. But let's start with Aspergillus penicilloides. Now, there are a number of metabolites here that we know that this particular fungi makes. And I also need to let you know in some cases, these metabolites have been identified for beneficial uses in pharmaceutical medicine. And this 4th one on the list here is a very good example of this, although you certainly wouldn't want to be inadvertently exposed to it in your home or office. Other metabolites are less well understood, but some are very well researched. And in the case of cristatin A, we know it has immunosuppressive effects. Now, the microbiome of a home or office shifts with water intrusion, and we also know that means it supports more gram-negative bacteria and general microbial growth anyway. And any occupants of those buildings are at risk of developing infections based on those microorganisms. But in addition to that, we see metabolites that are specifically immunosuppressive, meaning that renders the occupants more vulnerable to infection. And we do typically see people living and working in water damaged buildings experiencing much more frequent respiratory tract infections and symptoms and general ill health as well as a result. Now, the health effects that are specifically linked to this species of Aspergillus, we know it has a particular impact on the respiratory tract system, responsible for triggering allergic rhinitis and other atopic symptoms. Additionally, it increases the proliferation of dust mites, which we know then enhances allergic skin reactions as well as airway inflammation, and the risk of asthma attacks increases exponentially. It can, of course, cause fungal skin infections as well, but it's predominantly that atopic presentation that we see. And most likely you may pick this up by noting a patient is constantly taking antihistamines or constantly experiencing skin rashes, or they've got watery eyes, runny nose every time you assess them. Now, I need to point out that this particular species proliferates at a relative humidity of 71%. This is important because you don't even need a water intrusion event to have this fungal microorganism start to proliferate. Certainly here in Sydney, where humidity is often elevated above 70% much of the year round, anyone not monitoring the relative humidity in their home and managing that through the use of a dehumidifier can end up with an overgrowth of Aspergillus penicilloides based on that alone, without ever having a burst pipe or a leaky roof or a dishwasher overflow. Now, moving on to another Aspergillus species, this time versicolor, we can see here this one produces a number of different metabolites, including microbial VOCs, or volatile organic compounds. We're going to look at each of these in detail now, but just know that the VOCs are the element of fungal metabolites that contribute to the characteristic odors that you can get with microbial overgrowth. Some of those are classic mold smells of musty and dusty and dirty socks, but we can also see fruity smells, vomit smells, mushroom ethanol smells, and even a VOC smells a bit like marijuana. So essentially, if anywhere in your home or office smells of anything, you have some kind of microbial problem, more than likely. So looking at this particular compound, this is probably the most well understood metabolite of versicolor, and it is a very potent carcinogen as well as a mutagen and teratogen. Now, based on that alone, we know that anyone living for an extended period of time in a water damaged building, their risk of cancer is exponentially increased. We also know women trying to conceive or who are pregnant being exposed to a metabolite like this are potentially going to have issues with their unborn children based on its mutagenicity. Now, it also causes necrosis of the liver and kidneys. We see a huge range of effects on the liver based on animal studies, and because of its impact on the gut and the liver, we can also see loss of appetite, weight loss, and diarrhea. It's also important to know that this particular compound can also be converted into aflatoxins by other microorganisms, including some of those that are residents in our gastrointestinal tract. Maltodextrin is another compound that versicolor produces, and we know in cattle that have been exposed to it, it causes tremors, lumbar paralysis, weakness in the legs, loss of appetite, and decreased lactation. Post-mortem examination found circulatory disturbances, and we know in the case of humans living in water-damaged buildings, particularly those that go on to develop SIRS, we see inflammatory cytokines damaging the microcirculation, affecting capillary blood flow, and of course, with the loss of vascular endothelial growth factor, circulatory problems are in fact very, very common. Another metabolite here is shown to be mildly toxic, teratogenic, hepatotoxic, and nephrotoxic. So I think you're starting to get a sense for why a little bit of mold can absolutely be a very big problem. Now, in the case of cyclopeiazonic acid, we know that this actually really impacts VGCZs, or voltage-gated calcium channels, really impacting calcium efflux into the cells, which can cause a number of derangements in cellular metabolism. In this case, it certainly has a very profound neurotoxic effect, as well as impacting the immune system. Necrosis of the liver, gut, kidneys, and skeletal tissue have been reported. And we know it's carcinogenic in birds, causing pathological changes in the spleen and the bursa of Fabricius. In terms of VOCs, whether they're man-made or microbially made, we know they can cause headaches, trouble with concentration, dizziness, inattentiveness. Many of them are also carcinogenic, but thankfully these are a bit easier to spot than mycotoxins, because typically they do have some kind of odor to them, which means if there is any kind of odor in a home, that is a red flag that moisture intrusion may have occurred, and you certainly want to be examining what the microorganism profile of that area looks like. Chaetomium globosum is another water damaged mold, and a toxigenic one at that. It produces a number of different metabolites, some of which are better understood than others. But in the case of globosum, this is a very toxic mycotoxin. It can cause, or this particular mold, of course, can cause all kinds of infections in the skin. It can contribute to fungal pneumonia, but globosum itself has been dubbed the narcolepsy toxin, and appears to be responsible for the immediate fatigue and sleepiness that many SIRS patients experience on exposure to this particular mold. Now, the most toxigenic mold that we know about at the moment is Stachybotrys chartarum. It is erroneously been dubbed the black mold, which unfortunately is a silly moniker, because fungal growth can appear all sorts of different colors based on the substrate, not just the species, and many molds appear to be black and are not Stachybotrys chartarum. But for those of you familiar with that term, that is what people are actually pointing to. Now, many of the metabolites this mold produces are trichothecenes and are extremely toxic. We'll explore those in detail in a moment. But there are other mycotoxins it produces that don't fit into this category. Now, one thing I do want to let you know is that many mycotoxins are in fact antibiotics. When microorganisms are fighting with each other for resources like food and water, fungal microorganisms will produce antibacterial compounds, the most famous of which is penicillin. Now, what this means is, in a building where there's a lot of mold growth, there is going to be absorption, inhalation, and ingestion of antibiotic compounds. Now, crotocin is one such example, penicillin is another, but there are many other examples that I could give you, but I want you to understand the impact that that has on a human being's microbiome. So, irritable bowel type symptoms, SIBO, shifts in the microbiome of the person can very often be triggered by antibiotics that they are being exposed to as a result of water damage in their home. Now, looking at trichothecenes generally, we know that they have effects across multiple different organ systems. We see loss of appetite, weight loss, growth retardation in children, nervous disorders, alterations in cardiovascular function, a depressed immune system, skin responses. It affects fertility in a very significant way and damages the bone marrow. And of course, there are consequences to that as well. Dermal application or oral ingestion can cause skin irritation, burning, itching, rashes, blisters, and bleeding. And in fact, Stachybotrys is well known to trigger bleeding noses and also hemoptysis, or coughing up blood, in patients exposed to this mold. Of course, eye contact is going to be problematic with this mycotoxin, and we also see nausea, vomiting, fatigue, difficulty breathing, and acute vascular effects as well, as you would expect in anyone who's been exposed to a potent toxin. Now, there are different effects associated with different types of trichothecenes. I've picked out a couple to point you towards here. So citrotoxin H is known to create a rash that becomes a moist dermatitis. This is also a contributor to nosebleeds, chest pain, bleeding in the lungs, an elevated basal temperature, headache, and fatigue. Whereas citrotoxin G can initiate acute inflammation responses in the lungs and the olfactory sensory neurons, and in fact, that can extend right up into the brain, causing mild focal encephalitis. So, when you're assessing someone for central nervous system effects, you've got to keep in mind neurotoxic chemicals that are being produced in their home by water damage molds. Roridin E also is acutely hepatotoxic. It can cause a significant increase in glucose 6 phosphatase of the liver. And so, wherever we're seeing elevated liver enzymes, we've always got to find the source of the toxicity. And I don't know how many practitioners actually look at the potential of a water damage building for this as a first line of action, if at all. This particular mycotoxin also acutely damages the kidneys. And so in those patients where you're seeing liver and kidney damage that seems inexplicable, perhaps water damage is an explanation. Lastly, Wallemia sebi is another water damage mold found in buildings where water intrusion has occurred. Walleminol, walleminone, and wallemadione are some of the compounds that it produces. And overall, this particular mold can also cause fungal allergic reactions, including farmer's lung disease. It particularly triggers respiratory issues, exacerbating asthma, causing hypersensitivity pneumonitis, chronic bronchitis, and rhinosinusitis. So again, patients that are struggling to stay on top of their asthma and manage it very well, or what looks like seasonal allergies that are available all year round, definitely a red flag pointing towards water damage. Now, as I said, this is not an exhaustive list of toxigenic molds. There are many, many more, but those that are picked up on the Hurts Me Too, we covered today. And I certainly hope that gives you some insight into the way in which a person's home or the office in which they work might significantly be impacting their health and be quite a serious contributor to disease or any of the pathologies that they are experiencing. If you have any questions, please do reach out. The references are there available. And I certainly hope that this has opened your eyes to a very insidious and invisible source of environmental disruption.